drawing on what I do with the Marshall Islands Ship Registry, and I've been with them for 41 years now, practically. So I have a little bit of background and a little bit of perspective, maybe the wrong perspectives, maybe mistaken impressions. You know, you cling to them as you get, the older you get. I'm getting pretty old, and age, I want to talk about age in a different context, the age of ships. I'd like to say a few words about the El Faro case. We lost 33 human beings in that case, in that terrible incident. And there are going to be conclusions drawn by the National Transportation Safety Board, by the Coast Guard, and these conclusions, I think, will largely focus on safety standards. Now, the El Faro was not a Marshall Islands flag ship, but I think the lessons that may be learned, and I hope will be learned, and we don't know yet what they are, I don't know, I don't claim to know, but I think that we can get a fairly clear picture of what the experts are going to be looking at. Age of the ship, 40 years. Safety standards, as I said a minute ago, what were they? At the present time, a 40-year-old ship, regardless of flag, but certainly including U.S. flag, has certain safety features which we lawyers like to call grandfathered. In other words, the ship itself may have life-saving appliances that were built to standard 20, 30 years ago, maybe a little bit more. They're not required to be upgraded to 2016 at the present time. I think that's going to come in for some examination, quite frankly, and I think it should. There is a thing called the Alternate Compliance Program, or ACP. Many of us, maybe all of you, know what it is. But simply stated, it's the program presently operated by the U.S. Coast Guard in which certain survey and classification societies that are known in the trade as ROs, recognized organizations. That's MARPOL and SOLAS speak, but it's ROs include the classification societies. They are the delegates, if you will, of certain inspection and certification requirements from the flag state, whether it's the United States of America or the Marshall Islands or Panama or the United Kingdom or what have you. The problem, and this is generally across the industry, is that where you have a 40-year-old ship built to standards that were valid 40 years ago and may have been upgraded at various times, it's a little bit different from having the same standards with regard to including something like the Alternate Compliance Program for a ship that is new or relatively new. Just to give you a little bit of perspective, the average age of a ship registered in the Marshall Islands, which my administration runs, is 8 years old. That's the average age. Now, some of them are older, some of them are newer, but think about that for a minute and realize that, all right, a ship that was built 8 years ago in a Chinese yard may be up to standards, it may not be. There may be safety deficiencies, but nevertheless, the standards imposed by the international community 8 years ago were and are different from those standards that were imposed and required 40 years ago. Something to think about. And I think the debate resulting from the loss of El Faro is going to focus to some extent on that factor. I'd like to touch on one or two other things, and I'm very conscious of the time. Sean mentioned climate change. COP21, which is and COP22, which are the verbal code for the negotiations concluded in Paris. Emissions control regulations are going to have a very big effect on what ships look like going forward, how they are crewed, and the training of crew. The same is true of the fact that an increasing number of ships are being planned, and some are being built with natural gas as a fuel. That's going to change the way ships look. And we're seeing that already with the totem ships that are being built on the West Coast for tote. They are going to be, the requirements are different for fuel storage and space, this amount of space that's taken up, and the economics are going to change. I'd like to say a word or two while we're talking about crewing and training about electronic charts, ECDIS, electronic charts. Anybody here who doesn't know what ECDIS is? ECDIS? No one will admit it. There is clearly, and have been a number of fairly high-profile casualties in the last year or two, where the bridge team obviously didn't know much about ECDIS and were using out-of-date charts because they were old paper charts. ECDIS is actually a navigational tool, rather like a gyro compass in a way. It's not like a gyro compass, but it has a navigational function, as well as simply being able to read a chart. And what we're finding is quite a few crew people, yes, like lawyer people, cannot actually use ECDIS because they haven't been trained to. And that is a problem. I'd like to talk a little bit about what's happening with the Marshall Islands because it's very relevant to what we heard from the last panel. We are undertaking a study of the incidence of suicide and attempted suicide among crew members on Marshall Islands flagged ships. Obviously, because it is an open registry or flag of convenience, we're talking about a diverse crew slice. Hundreds of thousands of licensed seafarers or certified seafarers, certificated seafarers from all over the world. Notably, of course, from the Philippines, India, Eastern Europe, Myanmar. There are several interesting things that are coming out. First of all, flag states like the Marshall Islands and like the US are gathering more and more data. This is the age of big data. Because there's more and more data being gathered, we have the ability, we the international community and the shipping industry, to learn from that data if we are willing to do so and take the data and process it and above all, publicize it. It's got to be, it can't be kept a secret. Shipping industry loves secrecy. It's a it's like bean counting, you know, cost cutting for its own sake. You know, think Deepwater Horizon. Secrecy for its own sake is another enemy of progress, but we have a lot of it, I'm afraid, in this industry. What we're learning just from the data on suicides and attempted suicides that we know about, many of which, of course, take place after the seafarer has gone ashore, and hopefully many of which are thwarted. But there is a big, isolation does play a big part. Unfortunately, so does the internet, as we're finding. Many seafarers attempt to take their own lives, tragically, after they've gotten bad news from home. Until very recent times, you didn't get much news from home. And we've all been, and I certainly have been, a big advocate of internet connectivity. But there's a dark side to that, too. Because you can be a seafarer from Cebu City in the Philippines or from Gdansk and not hear from home, and therefore not hear the bad news. Your spouse is leaving you, you know, your favorite uncle died, something that triggered a depressive response. And we haven't quite wrapped our minds or our abilities around, or our willpower around, what to do about that. But I just want you to know that flag states are not, you know, blank pieces of paper. We do, in fact, gather and study these things, and we are concerned about them. And gatherings like this are very important because this is how we address, or begin to address, how to deal with them. A word about the Maritime Labor Convention. It doesn't deal with this kind of issue. It is not a sovereign remedy for all ills, rhetorically, figuratively, or actually. I'm almost done. Well, at least for the moment. Crew watches. We are working very closely with a number of major vessel operators around the world. The 3-shift crew watch system, bridge watch system, I should say, is still unfortunately in existence, but we find that fatigue, we all know how big a problem fatigue is, and how many accidents occur because somebody dozed off, or because the bridge team were just stressed out, particularly on the smaller type of vessel. The reduction in the number of crew, which we're seeing in so many places around the world, is a major cause of casualties and, frankly, of the stress that results in serious illness. And again, going back to the issue of suicide and attempted suicide, the pressures that are put on the seafarers grow and grow and grow as the number of seafarers on a particular ship, particularly the bridge team, is reduced. Again, beware of bean counteritis. There's a lot of that around. That's a disease too, but it's a disease of management. The number of watches and the way the watches are handled is something that needs a great deal more attention than it is getting. I've touched on a few subjects at random. I realize it's a scattergun approach, but I think we do need to look at certain seafarer-related, on the way in which some ships, I haven't even mentioned life-saving appliances, maybe I did mention them. We continue to see serious casualties and loss of life and injury. Part of this is due to the fact that the seafarers are not being trained how to do the lifeboat safety drills. And many of these involve passenger ships, big ones, going in into port. Sometimes they're in dry dock, and they test the equipment. People are being injured, people are being killed. There are training problems, there are equipment problems. And again, this needs to be faced much more carefully. We are trying to do that in the Marshall Islands. I'm happy to say we have not had very many Marshall Islands related lifeboat safety and life-saving appliance casualties. By the way, the Marshall Islands flag, for those of you who don't know, is the 3rd largest in the world in terms of tonnage and the number of ships, both. Something to think about. We focus an awful lot of these gatherings on, for example, the U.S. flag, which of course has shrunk drastically, I'm sorry to say, in recent years. But the Panama flag is enormous, the Liberian flag is enormous, Marshall Islands flag is enormous, and it is possible now in this era of big data to get your heads around some of the issues that we're talking about in the context of how these very, very large flag state administrations operate. Thank you very much. Sorry to go on further.